Marie von Brühl sat in the dimly lit study, the flickering candlelight casting elongated shadows across the parchment-covered desk. Her delicate fingers, though accustomed to the elegance of aristocratic life, now traced the ink-stained pages filled with Karl's final thoughts. It had been nearly 5 years since his passing. And yet, his presence lingered in every line, every carefully chosen word. She adjusted the oil lamp, bringing the papers into sharper focus. If she was to ensure the world understood Karl's vision, then she could not afford sentimentality, not yet. The air was thick with the scent of old books and melted wax. Stacked neatly before her were volumes of notes, drafts, and letters, Karl's life's work. Vom Kriege, on war. The world knew Clausewitz as a military theorist, a man whose sharp intellect dissected the chaos of battle with precision. But few knew the battles he had fought outside the battlefield, the political betrayals, the intellectual isolation, the internal struggle to articulate what war truly was. Fewer still knew that, behind all of it, stood Marie von Brühl. She dipped the quill into the inkwell, the dark liquid seeping into the nib. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she prepared to continue the task she had begun months ago, organizing and preparing Karl's manuscript for publication. It was not merely an act of devotion, it was an act of defiance. History, she knew, had little patience for the contributions of women, especially those who worked from the shadows. Marie leaned back for a moment, closing her eyes, allowing herself to drift back to the beginning, to the moment she first met Karl. The man who would change her life forever. Berlin, 1803. The grand halls of the Brühl estate buzzed with laughter and music. The aristocracy of Prussia swirling in an orchestrated dance of politics and power. Marie, a young woman of 24, moved gracefully through the crowd, her mind only half attentive to the pleasantries exchanged around her. She had grown up surrounded by such gatherings, where alliances were forged over glasses of Riesling and whispered negotiations. Her father, Count Heinrich von Brühl, had ensured that she received the finest education, one that extended beyond the frivolities expected of women of her station. Marie, her mother's voice cut through the hum of conversation. There is someone you must meet. She turned, her sharp blue eyes landing on the man standing beside her mother. He was unlike the polished nobleman who normally sought her attention. His uniform, though well kept, lacked the ostentation of those who measured wealth by the embroidery on their coats. His features were sharp, his posture disciplined, and yet there was something in his expression, an intensity that suggested he did not merely observe the world, but sought to understand it. Karl von Clausewitz, her mother introduced, her tone carrying a hint of hesitation. He is one of the promising young officers in the Prussian army. Karl bowed stiffly. It is an honor, Countess von Brühl. Marie studied him for a moment before inclining her head. The honor is mine, Herr Clausewitz. She expected him to engage in the usual small talk, the tedious flattery men of his rank often employed when addressing women of hers. Instead, he said nothing. His eyes flickered over the book she had been holding, a leather-bound volume of Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary. You enjoy Voltaire? He asked at last. Marie arched a brow, intrigued. Should I not? He smiled slightly, the first sign of warmth breaking through his otherwise guarded demeanor. Most young ladies at these gatherings seem more interested in poetry than political philosophy. She tilted her head. And what of you, Herr Clausewitz? Do you find philosophy unworthy of military men? His smile deepened, though his eyes remained sharp. On the contrary, war is, after all, the continuation of politics by other means. How can one fight if one does not first understand the world they fight for? Marie felt the corners of her lips curve. A thoughtful answer. I suppose you have read Montesquieu as well? Karl nodded. Of course. And Rousseau, Machiavelli, Kant. A soldier and a philosopher. She mused. A rare combination. He hesitated, then replied. Not as rare as one might think, though few have the privilege of discussing such matters in these halls. Marie's interest was piqued. Most men sought to impress her with empty pleasantries. But Karl Clausewitz had engaged her in a conversation of substance. She could see it in his eyes, the relentless curiosity, the hunger for knowledge. He was a man who sought truth, even when it was inconvenient. That night, long after the music had faded and the guests had departed, Marie found herself staring out of her window, her mind restless. For the first time, she had met a man who saw beyond her title, beyond her lineage. Karl von Clausewitz was different. And that, she knew, was dangerous. Over the next year, their encounters became more frequent, their conversations deeper. Karl was stationed in Berlin, working under the reformist General Scharnhorst, a man committed to modernizing the Prussian army after its humiliating defeats against Napoleon. Marie, for her part, found herself drawn into discussions of strategy and statecraft. It was through these discussions that she realized just how constrained Karl was by the rigid structures of the Prussian military hierarchy. He was brilliant, but brilliance was not always rewarded in a system that valued obedience over intellect. Marie, however, understood power, not just on the battlefield, but in the courts and drawing rooms where decisions were truly made. She began introducing him to influential figures, ensuring that his ideas were heard by those who mattered. She shared with him the political maneuverings she had observed within the aristocracy. The silent wars waged not with swords, but with words and alliances. Karl, in turn, taught her the intricacies of military thought, of the delicate balance between strategy and chaos. Their relationship was not one of idle romance but of mutual elevation. She refined his ideas, challenged his assumptions, and in doing so, became not just his wife, but his most trusted confidant. Now, as she sat in the study years later, with Karl's words spread out before her, Marie knew that her role was not yet finished. The world would remember Clausewitz as the great military thinker, but she would ensure that his true vision was preserved. She dipped the quill into ink and began writing once more. After all, war was not merely fought on the battlefield, and neither was history. Marie von Brühl had been born into privilege, but privilege alone did not define her. The Brühl family name carried weight, an inheritance of power, wealth, and political influence that stretched back generations. She was the great-granddaughter of Heinrich von Brühl, the infamous statesman who had once controlled Saxony's fate, a man both revered and reviled for his extravagant policies and political maneuverings. But by the time of Marie's birth in 1779, the Brühl dynasty, though still influential, had learned the perils of excess. Her father, Count Heinrich von Brühl, understood that power in Prussia was shifting. The old aristocracy, with its idle indulgences and unquestioned authority, was being challenged by the tides of war and revolution sweeping across Europe. France had executed its king. Napoleon had risen from obscurity. The world was no longer one where noble blood alone guaranteed security. And so, he raised Marie differently. Unlike many young noblewomen who were taught only the arts of etiquette, embroidery, and courtly conversation, Marie was encouraged to think. She was given access to her father's extensive library, where she devoured works by Voltaire, Rousseau, and Kant. She learned languages, French, Latin, and English, so that she could engage with ideas beyond Prussia's borders. More importantly, she was taught the art of observation. She would sit in the grand salons of Berlin, silent but attentive, as diplomats, military officers, and statesmen debated the fate of Europe. She listened to the whispers of alliances being forged over glasses of wine. The coded language of power and persuasion. From an early age, she understood that true influence did not always come from those who held titles but from those who could shape the minds of those who did. But despite her education, despite her sharp intellect, she was still a woman. And women, no matter how intelligent, were expected to marry well and serve as ornaments to their husbands' ambitions. Marie had no intention of simply being an ornament. The House of Brühl and its political ties. The Brühl estate in Berlin was a relic of a bygone era. Its high ceilings and opulent halls a reminder of a time when the family had wielded immense power. Though their influence had waned since the days of her great-grandfather, they remained deeply embedded in the Prussian elite. Marie's childhood had been filled with lessons on diplomacy, on the subtle art of controlling a conversation without ever raising one's voice. Her mother, Countess Sophie von Brühl, had mastered the role of a noblewoman perfectly, graceful, intelligent, and utterly unshakable in social settings. From her, Marie learned how to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. Her father, however, was the one who shaped her mind. He had served as a close advisor to Frederick William II. Though he had always been wary of the king's indulgent lifestyle, he saw the dangers of a stagnant nobility, one too preoccupied with luxury to recognize the shifts happening in the world beyond Berlin. "Marie," he would say, watching her as she sat cross-legged on the study floor, reading by candlelight, "knowledge is a weapon, but like any weapon, it must be wielded correctly. A fool with a sword is no more dangerous than a child with a book." She took his words to heart. By the time she was 16, she had already begun to form her own opinions on governance, on war, on the responsibilities of power. When she turned 18, her parents began receiving marriage proposals, young noblemen eager to align themselves with the Brühl name. Marie entertained them with polite indifference, but none intrigued her. They were boys dressed as men, speaking in rehearsed platitudes. It was not until she met Karl von Clausewitz that she finally found someone who spoke the same language as her own mind. A clash of worlds, the aristocrat and the soldier. Marie and Karl were, by all accounts, an unlikely pair. He was not of noble birth. His father had been a low-ranking officer, and though Karl had ascended through the ranks through sheer brilliance, he lacked the aristocratic pedigree that so many in Prussia valued. Yet, in their first conversation, Marie saw something in him that no noble suitor had ever possessed, a mind unafraid to challenge, to question, to demand more from the world. At first, her parents were skeptical. Though Karl had potential, he was not a man of status. Marrying him would not strengthen the Brühl family's political standing. But Marie did not care for that. She had spent her life among men who wielded power but lacked vision. Karl had vision. More importantly, Karl had something else, ambition. Not for wealth or social standing, but for understanding. It was a trait she recognized in herself. Against the wishes of some in her family, she chose him, and in doing so, she chose a life that would take her far from the comfort of the Brühl estate. She did not yet know it, but the world was on the brink of war. Napoleon was marching across Europe, reshaping the continent with every battle. And soon, both she and Karl would be caught in the storm, the looming shadow of war. As the year 1805 arrived, Prussia stood at a crossroads. The winds of war were growing stronger, and Napoleon's ambitions showed no sign of restraint. Some in the Prussian court believed they could remain neutral, that France's wars would not touch Berlin. Others saw the writing on the wall. Napoleon was not a man content with half measures. Karl, ever the strategist, saw the dangers long before many of his superiors did. And Marie, ever the observer, saw something else, the fragility of the Prussian elite, the way they clung to outdated notions of war and honor. Over candlelit discussions in their home, Karl and Marie spoke not as husband and wife, but as equals engaged in an intellectual war of their own. They still believe wars are won with cavalry charges and honor. Karl murmured one night, his brow furrowed as he studied a map of Europe. They refused to see that Napoleon fights with an entirely new strategy. Speed, flexibility, the destruction of an enemy's will before they even reach the battlefield. Marie poured herself a glass of wine, her gaze steady. Then they will lose. Karl looked up at her, surprised by the bluntness of her words. She continued, war is not what it was 50 years ago. Prussia has not fought a true war since Frederick the Great. The generals are clinging to ghosts. Karl exhaled sharply. Exactly. Marie leaned forward. Then what will you do? Karl hesitated, then replied, I will learn. I will study Napoleon's methods, his thinking, and when the time comes, I will fight not as they expect me to, but as he does. Marie nodded. Then you must also prepare for something else. Karl frowned. And what is that? She met his gaze. Politics. War is only one battlefield. If you truly wish to change Prussia, you must win the war off the battlefield as well. Karl leaned back in his chair, considering her words. It was a conversation they would have many times in the years to come. And though neither of them knew it yet, the storm was about to break. Marie von Brühl had been born into power, but it was not her lineage that would shape history. It was the mind she possessed, and the man she had chosen to stand beside. Marie von Brühl had never been one to believe in fairy tale love. Raised in the cold world of Prussian aristocracy, she had learned early on that marriage was often a transaction rather than a union of souls. Women of her status were expected to marry well, to secure alliances. Wealth and stability, love, if it ever existed, was an afterthought, a fragile sentiment that rarely outlived the first few years of marriage. And yet, against all odds, she found herself in love, not with the idea of marriage, nor with the security it provided, but with the man who had stolen her thoughts long before he had taken her hand in marriage. Karl von Clausewitz was unlike any other man she had ever met. Where others sought power, he sought knowledge. Where others adhered blindly to tradition, he questioned everything. He was a soldier, yes, but he was not merely a warrior. He was a thinker, a strategist, a philosopher of war, and, perhaps most importantly, he saw her, not as an ornament, not as an extension of her family name, but as an equal. Their marriage, though born of love, was also a partnership. From the very beginning, they knew that their union would not follow the traditional path of noble marriages. They would not be content with idle comforts, with hosting extravagant dinners or playing the roles expected of them. Their life together would be one of ideas, of discussions that stretched long into the night, of shared ambitions and battles fought not just on the field but in the halls of power. Even before they were married, Marie had played a crucial role in Karl's intellectual and professional life. Her connections within the aristocracy had opened doors for him, allowing him access to circles that would have otherwise been closed to a man of his modest birth. She introduced him to influential figures, whispered words in the right ears, and ensured that his ideas were heard by those who mattered. But she was not merely a facilitator of his career, she was his intellectual sparring partner. Karl had once written that war was the continuation of politics by other means. Marie, in turn, argued that politics was the battlefield on which wars were won before the first shot was ever fired. Together, they refined their understanding of strategy, debating the philosophies of Machiavelli, Montesquieu, and Kant, dissecting the failures of past wars and predicting the course of future conflicts. To outsiders, their marriage may have seemed unconventional, even peculiar. It was rare for a noblewoman to engage in discussions of warfare. Rarer still for a soldier to value the opinions of his wife in such matters. But to Karl and Marie, it was the foundation of their bond. And soon, that bond would be tested in ways neither of them could have foreseen. The year 1806 arrived like a storm on the horizon. Napoleon, having already humiliated Austria and Russia, now turned his sights toward Prussia. The court in Berlin was divided. Some believed that Prussia could remain neutral. Others, including King Frederick William III, saw war as inevitable. Karl, ever the realist, knew that Prussia was woefully unprepared. Its military, once the pride of Europe under Frederick the Great, had become stagnant, clinging to outdated tactics in a world that had already moved forward. Napoleon's armies were faster, more adaptable, and commanded by officers who had been forged in the fires of revolution. Marie had watched with growing unease as the court debated strategy with the arrogance of men who had not set foot on a battlefield in decades. She had listened to generals dismiss Napoleon as an upstart, a mere opportunist who had been lucky rather than brilliant. She knew better, and so did Karl. On the eve of Prussia's declaration of war against France, Marie and Karl sat together in their study, a candle flickering between them. Maps lay scattered across the table, notes filled with Karl's analysis of the upcoming campaign. "They do not understand the enemy they face," Karl murmured, running a hand through his hair. "They believe this will be like the wars of the past, a matter of honor, of discipline. But Napoleon fights differently. He does not wait. He strikes before his enemy has even begun to march." Marie leaned forward, studying the map. "Then what will happen?" Karl exhaled. "We will lose." The certainty in his voice sent a chill down Marie's spine. "And what will you do?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I will do my duty. I will fight, but I will not die for their arrogance." Marie reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Then you must survive. No matter what happens, you must survive. Karl nodded. And you must prepare for what comes next. When Prussia falls, the court will turn against itself. Alliances will shift. You will need to be careful. Marie smiled faintly. I am always careful. Karl returned the smile, though there was sadness in his eyes. He knew what was coming. He had seen it written in the mistakes of Prussian generals, in the overconfidence of their leaders. And yet, duty demanded that he march to war. The next morning, he left for the front. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt was not merely a defeat, it was a catastrophe. Napoleon's forces, moving with breathtaking speed, shattered the Prussian army in a single day. Within weeks, Berlin had fallen, and the once mighty kingdom of Prussia was left in ruins. Marie, like so many others in the capital, watched in horror as French troops marched through the streets, their banners waving triumphantly. She knew that everything had changed. But she did not allow herself to grieve. While the court descended into panic, she acted. She gathered information, listened to the whispers of those who still held power, and began to prepare for Karl's return, if he returned at all. For weeks, there was no word. Then, at last, a letter arrived. Marie's hands trembled as she broke the seal, her heart pounding as she scanned the words. I am alive. Tears pricked at her eyes. But she forced them back. Karl had survived, but he had been taken prisoner by the French. He wrote of long marches, of exhaustion, of watching his comrades fall one by one. And yet, through it all, he remained determined. This war is not over. He had written, not for me, not for us. Marie closed her eyes, pressing the letter to her chest. War had already taken so much from them. But it would not take Karl. Not if she had anything to say about it. And so, as Prussia lay in ruins and the world turned its eyes to Napoleon, Marie von Brühl began the next battle, not on the battlefield, but in the courts, in the drawing rooms of the powerful, in the quiet conversations where the fate of nations was decided. She would not wield a sword, nor fire a musket. But make no mistake, Marie von Brühl was now at war. The autumn air in Berlin was thick with silence, an unnatural quiet that had settled over the city ever since Napoleon's forces had marched through its gates. What had once been a proud capital, home to kings and generals, was now a conquered city. French officers roamed the streets in their immaculate uniforms, their boots clicking against the cobblestones as they imposed their presence upon a humiliated Prussia. The aristocracy, once so sure of their nation's strength, had been reduced to reluctant hosts to the very men who had shattered their illusions of military invincibility. Marie von Brühl stood at the window of her family's estate, watching a group of French officers laughing among themselves as they passed by. She clenched her jaw, resisting the impulse to pull the curtains shut. Fear was a luxury she could not afford, not now. Not when Karl was still out there, somewhere, either fighting or captured, his fate unknown. News from the front lines had been bleak. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt had not been a battle at all. It had been a slaughter. The Prussian army, once the pride of Frederick the Great, had been dismantled in a single day, crushed beneath the weight of Napoleon's relentless strategy. Reports spoke of entire regiments obliterated, of commanders fleeing in disgrace, of soldiers surrendering en masse. And among them, somewhere in the chaos, had been Karl. For weeks, Marie endured the unbearable uncertainty. Had he been killed, wounded, taken prisoner? No one could tell her. The court of Frederick William III was in disarray, the king himself having fled eastward, abandoning Berlin to the enemy. The nobility whispered in hushed tones, trying to decide whether to resist or acquiesce. But Marie had no patience for their cowardice. While others prepared for exile, she prepared for war, the kind of war that was fought not with armies, but with information, negotiation, and survival. Then, at last, a letter arrived. The wax seal was unfamiliar. The handwriting rushed but unmistakable. Marie tore it open, her breath catching as she read the first words. I am alive. She sank onto the nearest chair, clutching the letter as if it were a lifeline. Karl had been taken prisoner, marched alongside thousands of other defeated Prussian officers, forced to endure the humiliation of captivity. But he was alive. And he was thinking. His letter was not one of despair but of observation. Napoleon does not win by strength alone. He wrote. He wins by speed. By breaking the enemy's will before the first shot is even fired. His armies do not simply defeat, they overwhelm. But even he is not invincible. Marie read the words again and again, the meaning settling deep within her. Karl was not just writing to reassure her. He was already planning, already analyzing Napoleon's weaknesses, already thinking of what came next. She could do no less. In the days that followed, Marie put all her energy into securing his release. She leveraged her family's connections, spoke in whispers to those who still held influence, and played the role of a dutiful noblewoman while carefully maneuvering through the politics of occupation. The French, she had learned, could be charmed as easily as any other men in power. And charm, when used correctly, was a weapon. By the spring of 1807, her efforts bore fruit. Karl was released. When he arrived in Berlin, he was thinner, his uniform worn, his expression harder than before. But his eyes still burned with the same sharp intelligence. The same fire that had drawn her to him all those years ago. They did not embrace in the street. They did not speak immediately. Instead, Marie simply met his gaze. And in that moment, they both understood. The war was not over. Not for Karl, not for her. Napoleon had won the battle. But the war was far from decided. Prussia, humiliated and diminished, was now shackled by the Treaty of Tilsit. The once mighty kingdom had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Forced into an uneasy alliance with the very man who had broken it. The army was restricted, its officers scattered, its future uncertain. Karl, along with many other Prussian soldiers, now faced a dilemma: serve under a French-dominated Prussia, or resist. Resistance, of course, was dangerous. To openly defy Napoleon was to invite death or exile. But Karl had never been one to accept servitude. And neither had Marie. Over long nights in their study, they spoke in hushed tones, discussing the future that Prussia could not yet see. Marie listened as Karl dissected Napoleon's campaigns, tracing the patterns of his victories, searching for the flaws in the empire that seemed unbreakable. And there were flaws. Napoleon's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He relied on momentum, on the sheer force of movement, on battles fought and won before the enemy could react. But what would happen if that momentum was broken? Marie leaned over the map that Karl had spread out before them, tracing the lines of Napoleon's conquests with her fingertips. He has not yet known true resistance, Karl murmured, watching her. Not the kind that lasts. The kind that stretches beyond a battlefield. Marie met his gaze. And if he does? Karl exhaled. Then he will fall. But not yet. Not soon enough. By 1812, the world had changed again. Napoleon had turned eastward, toward Russia, preparing for what he believed would be his final, greatest campaign. And Prussia, still shackled, was expected to march alongside him. The king, desperate to preserve what little power he had left, agreed to send troops under French command. Karl refused. To fight for Napoleon was to betray everything he believed in. To march alongside the man who had destroyed Prussia was unthinkable. And so, like many other Prussian officers who could not stomach the idea of serving the enemy, he made a choice that would change his life forever. He defected. Marie knew it was coming. She had seen it in his eyes for months, the growing frustration, the restless energy, the unwillingness to play the role of a loyal soldier in a conquered army. And when the time came, she did not try to stop him. Instead, she helped him leave, through carefully laid plans, through whispered conversations and falsified documents. Karl and a handful of like-minded officers made their way eastward, to Russia. There, they would fight, not for Napoleon, not for Prussia's king, but for the one cause they still believed in: the destruction of the empire that had broken their homeland. The night before he left, Marie sat beside him in their study, her hands resting over his as they pored over the maps one last time. Napoleon will not win in Russia, Karl said quietly. He does not understand what he is marching into. Marie nodded. Then you must make sure Prussia is ready when he falls. Karl pressed a kiss to her forehead. And you must be ready to do what I cannot. She understood what he meant. There were battles Karl could not fight, political battles, diplomatic maneuvers, the quiet war that would be waged in the courts of kings and the whispers of ministers. As Karl rode into the night, Marie watched until he disappeared from sight. She did not cry. She did not despair. Instead, she turned back toward Berlin, toward the city still under Napoleon's shadow. Her war had only just begun. The night Karl von Clausewitz rode away from Berlin was the last time Marie saw him for nearly 2 years. As the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the darkness, she stood alone in the doorway of their home, knowing that the man she had loved, the man she had fought for, was now in exile. Karl had chosen defiance. He had abandoned his post in the Prussian army, turned his back on the king who had surrendered to Napoleon, and fled eastward to Russia. In doing so, he had sealed his fate. If he ever returned to Prussia while it remained under French control, he would be branded a traitor. But Marie did not believe in fate. She believed in strategy. While Karl disappeared into the vast Russian Empire, she remained in Berlin, working in the shadows. She played the role expected of her, the dutiful noblewoman, the grieving wife whose husband had vanished into uncertain exile. But beneath the surface, she gathered information, listened carefully, and ensured that Karl's name was not forgotten among those who still dreamed of Prussia's liberation. And in the east, Karl was about to witness the greatest disaster of Napoleon's reign. Karl arrived in St. Petersburg in early 1812, just as Napoleon was preparing his grand invasion of Russia. The city, with its palaces of white stone and golden domes, was a world away from the broken remnants of Prussia. Russia, unlike Prussia, had not yet bowed to Napoleon. It was an empire vast and cold, ruled by a czar who still believed in the divine right of kings. At first, Karl was met with suspicion. He was a Prussian officer, a man whose homeland had been forced into an alliance with France. But those who met him quickly realized he was no loyalist to Napoleon. His defection was an act of defiance, not cowardice. And it was not long before he was introduced to General Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, the commander of the Russian armies. It was a fateful meeting. Barclay was unlike many Russian generals. He was a strategist, not a glory seeker. He understood what few others in the Russian court did. Napoleon's army could not be defeated in a traditional battle. The French were too fast, too well trained, too relentless. But Karl, in his months of studying Napoleon's methods, had come to the same conclusion. The key to defeating the French emperor was not to fight him as he expected. It was to break his momentum. The Russians cannot meet him head-on, Karl told Barclay. If you try, you will be crushed. Barclay narrowed his eyes. Then what do you suggest? Karl leaned forward. Let him come. Let him march into Russia. Deeper and deeper, where his supply lines will stretch thin. Burn everything before him. Give him nothing to conquer but ash and hunger. Make his army chase shadows through an endless winter. Barclay considered the words. It was not a new idea. Russia had used such a strategy before against invaders. But never had they faced an enemy like Napoleon. It will take time, Barclay murmured. The Tsar is impatient. The nobles want victory. Karl nodded. Then make them understand. Napoleon's strength is not just his army. It is his speed, his ability to force his enemies into battle before they are ready. Take that away from him, and you take away his power. It was a plan of destruction, of sacrifice. But it was the only way. And so, in the summer of 1812, as Napoleon's Grande Armée, over 600,000 men strong, crossed into Russia. Karl Clausewitz was there, watching, waiting, knowing that this would be the turning point of the war. Marie received only fragments of news from the east. Letters from Karl arrived sporadically, smuggled across the lines, each one carrying hints of the chaos unfolding in Russia. He is coming, Karl wrote in one letter. Faster than anyone expected, but we will not give him the battle he desires. Not yet. She read the words and knew what it meant. The Russians were retreating, drawing Napoleon deeper into their lands. Just as Karl had suggested. It was a dangerous game, one that required patience and a willingness to sacrifice cities, lands, and lives. But if it worked, it would be the undoing of an empire. Then, In September 1812, the world changed. A single name arrived in Berlin like a whispered prayer: Borodino. The great battle outside Moscow, the bloodiest of Napoleon's entire career, had been fought. Tens of thousands lay dead on both sides. But it was not the victory Napoleon had hoped for. The Russians, though battered, had not been broken, and then, in a move that shocked the world, they abandoned Moscow, setting it ablaze before Napoleon could claim it. Karl's next letter was brief. Moscow burns. He does not yet realize it. But he has already lost. Marie read the words and knew it was true. Napoleon had reached the heart of Russia. But it was a poisoned prize. The city was in ruins. His army, though victorious, was exhausted and starving. Winter was coming. The retreat began in October. Karl, along with the Russian forces, watched as Napoleon's army collapsed in the freezing Russian wilderness. The same men who had once marched across Europe like gods now froze in the snow, their bodies littering the roads back to France. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée staggered back across the border, fewer than 100,000 of the original 600,000 remained. Napoleon had suffered his first great defeat, and Karl had witnessed it firsthand. When Karl finally returned to Prussia in 1813, he was no longer an exile. He was a man who had seen the empire of Napoleon begin to crack. A man who knew that the moment to strike had come. But Prussia was still uncertain. The king, ever cautious, hesitated. The war was not yet won, and Napoleon was still a force to be reckoned with. Many in Berlin feared another disaster, another occupation, but Karl knew better. He had seen the cracks forming in the French war machine. He arrived in Berlin unannounced, stepping through the doors of their home as if he had never left. Marie, sitting at her desk, turned at the sound of his footsteps. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, at last, he spoke. "The time has come." Marie rose from her seat, crossing the room in measured steps until she stood before him. There was no embrace, no flood of emotion, only understanding. "What do you need?" she asked. Karl exhaled. "Everything." And so, together, they began again. The war was not over. But for the first time, they had the advantage. Napoleon had been wounded, his aura of invincibility shattered in the snows of Russia. Prussia, if it acted quickly, could reclaim its honor, its power, its freedom. Marie knew that Karl would return to the battlefield. She knew that, once again, she would be left behind to fight the war in her own way. But this time, they were not fighting for survival. This time, they were fighting to win. The war had changed everything. Karl von Clausewitz returned to Prussia not as an exile, not as a traitor, but as a man who had seen Napoleon bleed. His defection to Russia, once an unforgivable offense, was now a mark of foresight. The king, who had once hesitated to defy France, now found himself at a crossroads. With Napoleon's army shattered in the Russian winter, Prussia had an opportunity to rise again. But opportunity alone was not enough. Prussia had been broken, humiliated, stripped of its armies, its pride, its place among Europe's great powers. And while the war against Napoleon was far from over, Karl knew that victory on the battlefield would mean nothing if Prussia itself did not change. The old ways, the rigid hierarchies, the blind obedience, the outdated doctrines of war, had led to catastrophe. If Prussia was to survive, it needed reform. It needed men who could think, who could adapt, who could fight not just with swords and muskets, but with strategy. Karl was not alone in this belief. Others, officers, statesmen, reformers, had seen the same failures, had recognized the need for change. Chief among them was Gerhard von Scharnhorst, the brilliant general who had been working to modernize the Prussian army even before its collapse in 1806. Scharnhorst, a man who valued intellect over birthright, saw in Karl something rare, a soldier who was also a philosopher. A thinker who understood that war was not merely an exercise in discipline, but an extension of politics, psychology, and power. Marie, watching from the sidelines, understood what was at stake. The war had given Karl a second chance. But that did not mean his path would be easy. The Prussian court was still full of men who resented him, men who saw his defection as a betrayal rather than an act of foresight. And while Scharnhorst and a handful of others supported him, the old guard, the conservative generals who still clung to the myths of Prussian invincibility, would not accept him so easily. But Karl had never been one to seek approval. He had returned not to please the court, but to rebuild Prussia. The call to arms came swiftly. In March 1813, Prussia declared war on France. The War of the Sixth Coalition had begun. It was the moment Karl had been waiting for. Marie watched as he gathered his uniform, his maps, his letters of commission. This time, he did not leave as an outcast. He left as a Prussian officer once more. He had been reinstated, not at the highest rank he deserved. But it did not matter. What mattered was that he was once again in a position to shape the future. He rode to war alongside Blücher, Gneisenau, and Scharnhorst, joining the great campaign to drive Napoleon out of Germany. The battles were fierce, at Lutzen, Bautzen, Dresden, but this time, the Allies did not break. Karl was there, watching, learning, advising. He saw firsthand how Napoleon, though still formidable, was no longer invincible. The defeats in Russia had weakened him. And now, for the first time, the coalition was fighting as one. Then came the great battle. Leipzig, October 1813, the largest battle Europe had ever seen. 500,000 soldiers. 3 days of relentless combat. Karl was there. He saw the French lines crumble, saw Napoleon's forces retreat across the rivers, saw the emperor himself narrowly escape capture. The tide had turned. Napoleon, the man who had once dictated the fate of Europe, was now on the defensive. Marie received Karl's letter days later. It is over, not yet in Paris, not yet in name, but in reality. He cannot recover from this. We march forward now, and this time, we will not stop. The words filled her with a fierce pride. But she knew better than to celebrate too soon. Napoleon was beaten, but he was not yet defeated. The road to Paris would still be long. And for Karl, the war was only half the battle. As Prussian troops pushed into France, Karl saw victory on the horizon. But even in the midst of triumph, he was already thinking beyond the battlefield. Prussia might reclaim its place among the great powers. But if it did not change, it would only be a matter of time before it fell again. Marie, still in Berlin, understood this as well. She continued working behind the scenes, ensuring that Karl's ideas reached the right people, that his arguments for reform were heard. She watched as the power dynamics shifted. Frederick William III, once a weak and hesitant ruler, now sought to position Prussia as an equal among the victors. The old military elites, humbled by their failures, could no longer ignore the need for change. And yet, resistance remained. Karl's ideas were radical to some. His belief that war was a continuation of politics, that officers should be trained in strategy rather than blind obedience, that the army should adapt to modern warfare, these were not concepts that the traditionalists welcomed. Even after Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the struggle for Prussia's future was far from over. Karl, though recognized as a brilliant strategist, was still an outsider to many. He had spent too long among reformers, too long questioning old doctrines, too long thinking for himself. He was respected, but he was not yet fully trusted. It frustrated Marie to no end. She had watched him give everything to Prussia, his loyalty, his mind, his service, and yet, there were still those who doubted him, still those who saw him as too independent, too intellectual, too unwilling to play the game of court politics. And so, she played it for him. Marie attended the gatherings, spoke with the right people, ensured that Karl's contributions were acknowledged. She did not beg, did not plead, she wielded her influence as a scalpel, cutting away obstacles with careful precision. Bit by bit, Karl's position strengthened. By 1818, he was appointed director of the Prussian War College. It was not the grand command he deserved, but in some ways, it was even more important. Here, he would shape the future of Prussian military thought. Here, he would teach the next generation of officers. Here, he would begin writing the work that would define him for centuries to come. Marie watched as he buried himself in his studies, in his lectures, in his writing. She saw the way his mind worked, the way he wrestled with the fundamental nature of war itself. And she knew, long before anyone else did, that he was creating something extraordinary. The war was over, but Karl's greatest battle, the battle for ideas, had only just begun. Marie von Brühl had long known that Karl's mind was unlike any other. She had watched him study battlefields as if they were living organisms, had listened to him dissect Napoleon's campaigns with the precision of a surgeon. She had seen how his thoughts moved beyond tactics, beyond strategy, into something deeper, something fundamental. And now, at last, he was putting those thoughts into words. By 1818, Karl had been appointed director of the Prussian War College in Berlin. It was not the highest military command he might have hoped for, but it was, in many ways, the perfect position for him. Here, he was free to think, to write, to shape the minds of the next generation of Prussian officers. It was here that he would begin his magnum opus, Vom Kriege, on war. Marie understood, better than anyone, that this was not just another military manual. It was something more. She had always been Karl's first reader, his fiercest critic, his intellectual equal, and so, as he began writing, she took her place beside him, not merely as his wife, but as his editor, his advisor, his collaborator. Their study became a battlefield of ideas. Karl would pace the room, dictating his thoughts in a steady, measured voice, while Marie sat at the desk, transcribing, adjusting, challenging. There were days when their discussions turned into heated debates, when she would demand clarity on a point that seemed too abstract, when she would push him to refine his arguments. "You are too vague here," she would say, tapping her quill against the parchment. "You say that war is an extension of politics. But what does that mean in practice? What does it mean for the soldier on the ground?" Karl would pause, frowning, before nodding. "You're right," he would murmur. It must be clearer. He was not writing for the generals of today. He was writing for the soldiers of tomorrow. Marie ensured that his words were not just theories floating in the air, but principles that could be understood, applied, tested. She knew that Karl's ideas were revolutionary, that they challenged centuries of military thought. And she also knew that such ideas, if not presented properly, could be dismissed, misunderstood, or worse, forgotten. Together, they crafted a work that was unlike anything that had come before. War is more than just battle. That was Karl's central argument. He rejected the idea that war was simply about numbers, about formations on a battlefield. He argued that war was an extension of politics, shaped by the ambitions of nations, the will of governments, the spirit of the people. A general might command an army, but he did not operate in isolation. His decisions were influenced by rulers, by political forces, by history itself. Marie saw how these ideas had taken root in Karl's mind long before he ever wrote them down. She remembered their conversations in the early days of their marriage, when Napoleon was still conquering Europe, when Karl had first spoken of the dangers of rigid, outdated military doctrines. She remembered how he had predicted that Napoleon's greatest weakness was his own ambition. That if an enemy could endure long enough, the emperor would stretch himself too thin. She had always known that Karl was not just a soldier. He was a philosopher of war. And now, he was creating a book that would redefine the way war was understood. But writing on war was not just an intellectual challenge. It was a personal one. Karl was not a man who wrote in detachment, from the comfort of an ivory tower. He had lived through the wars he described. He had fought on the battlefields, had seen men die, had felt the weight of defeat and the cost of victory. There were nights when he would stop writing, his hands still, his eyes distant. Marie knew what he was thinking. He was remembering the marches through the frozen Russian wilderness, the burning of Moscow, the bodies left behind in the snow. He was remembering the fields of Leipzig, the chaos of battle, the thousands who had fallen in the struggle to bring down Napoleon. War was not just theory to him. It was real, and that was what made his work so powerful. Marie, ever practical, ensured that he did not allow himself to become lost in the past. You cannot write about war as if it is only suffering, she reminded him one evening. You must also write about its necessity, its purpose. Karl looked at her, the candlelight flickering across his face. War is terrible, he admitted, but it is also inevitable. It is woven into the fabric of human history. Marie nodded. Then make them understand that. Make them see why war happens, not just how it is fought. And so, he did. Years passed. The manuscript grew. Karl wrote about the friction of war, the idea that no battle ever goes according to plan. That uncertainty and chaos shape every campaign. He wrote about the fog of war, the way commanders must make decisions with incomplete information. The way war is never as clear-cut as theorists believe. And most importantly, he wrote about the trinity of war, the balance between the government, the military, and the people. Marie knew that these ideas would change everything. But she also knew that Karl would never be fully satisfied with his work. You will never finish this book, she told him one night, as he sat staring at his notes. Karl sighed. There is always more to say. She smiled. Then say what you can. Others will carry it forward. He returned her smile, but there was something unspoken in his eyes. Marie knew what it was. He did not trust others to understand his work as deeply as he did. And he was right to worry. Then, in 1830, everything changed. Cholera swept through Prussia. It was an invisible enemy, striking without warning, sparing neither the rich nor the poor, the strong nor the weak. Cities were gripped with fear. Families locked themselves inside their homes. Death crept through the streets in silence. And Karl, despite all his brilliance, despite all his caution, could not fight it. By the autumn of 1831, he fell ill. Marie did everything she could. She brought doctors, sat beside him, refused to believe that the man who had survived Napoleon's wars, who had ridden through fire and snow, who had faced death on the battlefield, could be taken by something as senseless as disease. But cholera did not care for courage or intellect. On November 16, 1831, Karl von Clausewitz died. He left behind an unfinished manuscript. And Marie, despite her grief, knew what she had to do. Karl had spent his life writing on war, but it would be Marie who ensured that the world read it. She gathered his notes, deciphered his final edits, worked tirelessly to complete the text as he had intended. She fought against publishers who doubted its importance, against military officials who questioned its relevance. She would not let his work be forgotten. Finally, in 1832, the book was published. It was not an instant success. Many did not yet understand its significance. But Marie knew that history would. She had spent her life standing beside a man who had seen war for what it truly was. And now, she had given the world his words. On war would not die with Karl. It would live on. The house was quiet now. The walls that had once echoed with the heated debates between Marie and Karl. The rooms where maps had been unfurled and battle strategies argued over, now stood in solemn stillness. The man who had filled them with restless energy, with thoughts of war and history, was gone. Marie von Brühl sat at Karl's desk, her hands resting on the unfinished pages of Vom Kriege. The ink had barely dried on his last revisions before death had taken him. Swift and cruel, like the wars he had spent his life studying, cholera had struck without warning, a force even the greatest strategist could not outmaneuver. She had known war intimately, had watched Karl ride off to battle time and time again, had waited for letters that might never come, had lived with the constant knowledge that any day could bring news of his death. But not like this, not from an enemy they could not see, could not predict. Grief had come for her, but she did not let it consume her. There was too much work to be done. Marie had always understood that Karl's ideas were not meant for their own time. His mind had moved ahead of the world, crafting a vision of war that few had yet grasped. He had never finished on war, not as he had wanted to. He had rewritten passages, restructured arguments, and left behind pages filled with notes, ideas that had not yet found their place in the text. Many would have let it go unfinished. Marie would not. She had spent decades as Karl's closest confidant, his first reader, his most trusted critic. If anyone could ensure that On War was published as he had intended, it was her. But it would not be easy. The Prussian military was hesitant. Karl had been respected, yes, but he had never truly been embraced by the establishment. His ideas were too unconventional, too challenging to the rigid traditions of Prussian warfare. Many in the military high command saw no need for his work to be published. War, to them, was still a matter of discipline and obedience, of tactics executed without question. Marie knew otherwise. She had seen Karl's mind at work. She had listened to his frustrations, had watched him dissect the very nature of war itself. She understood that On War was not merely a book, it was a revolution in thought. And so, she fought. In the months following Karl's death, Marie worked tirelessly. She gathered his notes, organized the drafts, and ensured that his ideas were as clear and precise as possible. She wrote letters to publishers, met with military officials, and used every ounce of influence the Brühl name still carried. She made it clear that On War was not just a theoretical work, it was essential. She argued that Prussia, still rebuilding itself after the Napoleonic Wars, needed Karl's ideas more than ever. The world had changed, and military strategy needed to change with it. Some listened, others dismissed her, but Marie did not back down. She had spent her life standing beside Karl, helping him refine his thoughts, sharpening his arguments. Now, she would ensure that his voice was not lost. Finally, after months of relentless effort, she succeeded. In 1832, On War was published. It was not an immediate success. Many did not yet understand its significance. Some dismissed it as too theoretical, too abstract. Others simply did not have the patience to read beyond its dense, complex prose. But Marie knew that history would catch up. She had seen how Karl's mind worked, how he had always been ahead of his time. And she was right. Years passed, and slowly, On War began to spread. It found its way into military academies, into the hands of young officers eager to understand war beyond the battlefield. It reached beyond Prussia, into France, Britain, Russia, nations that had once been Karl's enemies but now found wisdom in his words. Marie lived to see the first signs of its impact. She read letters from scholars who debated Karl's theories, from generals who began incorporating his ideas into their strategies. She heard whispers in military circles, discussions that echoed the conversations she and Karl had once had in the quiet of their study. And in those moments, she knew Karl had not died in vain. But Marie was not just fighting for Karl's legacy. She was fighting for recognition, her recognition. Women were not seen as scholars, as intellectual partners, as contributors to great works. Few, if any, understood the extent of her role in shaping On War. She had been there for every discussion, every revision. She had challenged Karl's arguments, refined his ideas, ensured that his thoughts were presented in a way that would endure. And yet, history would not remember her as his collaborator. It would remember her only as his widow. Marie accepted this, but she did not forget. She did not need history's approval. She knew the truth, and that was enough. In 1836, Marie von Brühl passed away. She died quietly, without the fanfare that had followed Karl's death. But she did not need monuments or grand tributes. Her legacy was already written, hidden in the pages of On War, in the words that Karl had spoken but that she had helped shape. Without her, the book might never have been published. Without her, Karl's ideas might have been lost to time. She had ensured that his voice would endure. And in doing so, she had written herself into history, even if no one knew it. Marie von Brühl's world had always been one of power and intellect, of diplomacy and war, of whispered negotiations and carefully chosen words. She had spent decades by Karl's side, refining his ideas, sharpening his arguments, ensuring that his thoughts were not just the reflections of a military man, but the foundation of something far greater. And now, with his death, all of that work stood on the precipice of being forgotten. Marie knew that On War was incomplete. She had watched Karl wrestle with his own thoughts, rewriting sections, discarding entire passages, struggling to capture the complexity of war in a way that no one before him had ever attempted. He had died before he could finish it to his own satisfaction. Many believed that it should remain unpublished. Some in the Prussian military saw no use for it. Karl's ideas were too radical, too complex. The very nature of his theories challenged the traditional view of war, one based on rigid structures, hierarchical obedience, and predefined tactics. Karl had argued that war was fluid, shaped by the unpredictable forces of politics, morale, and human nature. To those who preferred the certainty of doctrine over the ambiguity of theory, on war was unsettling. Marie did not care. She had not fought for Karl's legacy only to let it be discarded by those who did not understand it. And so, she began the battle to ensure that On War was not just published, but accepted, studied, and, one day, understood. The first challenge was practical, organizing Karl's notes. Though On War had been taking shape for years, Karl had never truly finished it. Some sections were fully formed, while others were little more than scattered ideas waiting to be refined. Marie had been there for all of it. She knew how Karl's mind worked, knew what he had intended even when his writing trailed off into unfinished thoughts. She gathered everything, every draft, every note, every unfinished page. She read through them over and over, her mind reconstructing Karl's voice, his intentions, the direction he had been taking. She did not change his words. She had too much respect for his work to impose her own ideas, but she structured them, ensured they were presented in the way he would have wanted. Then, she took the manuscript to publishers, and the rejections began. Some dismissed the book as too theoretical. Others argued that it was unnecessary. Prussia had won the war. Napoleon was defeated. What more needed to be said? Many simply did not see the value in Karl's work. War, to them, was a matter of experience, not philosophy. Generals did not need abstract theories, they needed tactics, strategies that could be applied in the field. Marie had heard all of these arguments before. She had heard them from the very same people who had refused to listen to Karl in life. The same officers who had once dismissed his warnings about Napoleon, who had clung to outdated doctrines even as Prussia was crushed under French boots. They had been wrong then, and they were wrong now. But the rejection was not just about the book. It was about her. A woman, even a noblewoman, had no place in military scholarship. If Karl had lived, he would have fought for his work to be recognized. He would have stood before these men and demanded they listen. But Karl was gone, and Marie, for all her intelligence, for all her experience, for all that she had contributed to the very creation of On War, was seen as nothing more than his widow. It infuriated her. She had shaped this work as much as Karl had. She had debated its arguments, had refined its ideas, had been there for every breakthrough, every struggle, every realization, and yet, when she spoke of it, when she fought for its importance, she was met with condescension. A woman could not possibly understand war. A woman could not possibly grasp military theory. A woman could not possibly be the one to ensure that the most important military text of the century saw the light of day. Marie was tired of these men. She had spent her life among them, watching them negotiate treaties, command armies, make decisions that affected the fates of entire nations. She had watched them fail, watched them cling to arrogance even as the world around them changed. She would not let them stop her now. Marie changed her approach. She stopped appealing to the military establishment. Instead, she turned to scholars, intellectuals, and political thinkers, the men who had already begun reshaping Europe in the wake of Napoleon's fall. She sought out those who understood that war was not just about the battlefield, but about politics, economics, diplomacy. Slowly, momentum began to build. Word of Karl's work spread through academic circles. Philosophers, statesmen, and reformers began to take an interest in his theories. Some dismissed them, but others recognized their brilliance. And then, at last, she found a publisher willing to take the risk. In 1832, On War was printed and distributed. It was not an immediate success. The first edition sold modestly. Many who picked up the book found it dense, difficult, unlike anything they had read before. It was not a manual of tactics, it was an analysis of war itself, of its nature, its unpredictability, its connection to politics. It would take years, decades, for its full impact to be understood. But Marie had done it. She had ensured that Karl's words would not die with him. Over time, On War began to find its place. Military academies in Prussia, then across Europe, began incorporating its ideas into their teachings. Generals and officers, some skeptical at first, began to see its value. Political thinkers cited it in discussions on war and diplomacy. By the mid-19th century, it had become required reading for those who sought to understand the art of war. Marie lived long enough to see the beginning of this transformation. She did not seek credit for her role. She did not demand recognition for the work she had done, the battles she had fought to ensure Karl's ideas were preserved. But she knew that without her, On War might never have been published. She knew that without her, Karl's ideas might have remained nothing more than notes gathering dust in a forgotten study. She had won her war, and though history would forget her name, she had ensured that Karl's would endure. That was enough. The years passed, and Europe changed once more. Prussia, once a broken and humiliated kingdom, had risen again, stronger than before. The scars of the Napoleonic Wars faded, replaced by a new era of militarization and expansion. A new generation of officers and statesmen now governed, many of them trained in the very doctrines that Karl von Clausewitz had pioneered. And yet, few spoke of Marie von Brühl, the woman who had fought to bring On War into the world, who had shaped its ideas, who had ensured that Karl's legacy would endure. She was forgotten. Her name appeared only as a footnote, a passing mention as the devoted wife who had seen her husband's work to completion. She had always known this would be the case. She had known that history had little patience for women who worked in the shadows, who shaped ideas rather than wielded swords, who fought battles not with armies, but with words, with intellect, with sheer force of will. But that did not make it right. Marie had not merely preserved On War. She had influenced it. She had been Karl's intellectual partner, his critic, his editor. She had questioned his ideas, refined his arguments, challenged him in ways no general or statesman ever had. Without her, On War would not have been the book that it became. Without her, it might never have been published at all. And yet, by the time of her death in 1836, her contributions had already begun to fade from memory. In the decades that followed, On War grew in stature. At first, it was studied only in military academies, its dense prose intimidating all but the most dedicated strategists. But as Europe entered a new era of conflict, one shaped by nationalism, industrialization, and expanding empires, Karl's theories took on new significance. By the late 19th century, generals across Europe had absorbed his ideas. Helmuth von Moltke, the Prussian military mastermind, adapted Clausewitz's concept of war as a continuation of politics, shaping it into the doctrine that would define the German Empire's military strategy. The wars of German unification, against Denmark, Austria, and France, were fought by men who had read Clausewitz, who had learned from his work. Marie was no longer there to see it. She was not there to witness how On War became a foundational text for military thought, how it shaped the strategies of Otto von Bismarck's Prussia, how it influenced every major European conflict leading into the 20th century. She was not there when officers on both sides of World War I cited Clausewitz's theories, when strategists of World War II pored over his analysis of war, of friction, of the delicate balance between political will and military action. But her influence remained, hidden beneath the surface. Every time a commander read On War, every time a leader absorbed its lessons, they were engaging with ideas that Marie had helped refine, helped shape, helped bring into existence. She had not fought for credit, but she had won something far greater. She had ensured that Karl's ideas, their ideas, would live beyond both of them. Even as On War shaped the world, Marie's name all but disappeared. Military historians rarely mentioned her. Biographers of Clausewitz treated her as a supporting character, an aristocratic wife who had dutifully completed her husband's work. rather than an intellectual force in her own right. No one spoke of how she had debated Karl on his own theories. No one spoke of how she had refined his ideas, pushing him toward greater clarity, forcing him to articulate his arguments in ways that others could understand. No one spoke of how she had fought against the skepticism of military institutions, how she had battled publishers and officials to ensure On War was released into the world. The world remembered Karl. It did not remember Marie. And yet, her fingerprints were on every page of his book. History, however, has a way of correcting itself. In recent years, scholars have begun to rediscover the role that women played in shaping intellectual history, not just as supporters, but as active contributors, as thinkers, as collaborators. And so, the name Marie von Brühl has begun to emerge once more. Historians now acknowledge that On War was not the work of a single man, but of a partnership. Modern scholars have revisited Marie's influence, have recognized her as more than just the woman who ensured Karl's book was published. They have acknowledged her as an intellectual force, a woman who shaped one of the most influential military texts in history. Her story is no longer just one of quiet devotion. It is one of brilliance, of persistence, of an intellect that refused to be dismissed, even in an era that refused to acknowledge it. And though history may have forgotten her for nearly 2 centuries, she was always there, in every line of On War, in every strategy shaped by its lessons, in every soldier, every general, every statesman who turned to Karl von Clausewitz's work to understand the nature of war. Marie von Brühl was there, even if no one knew it. The candle burned low in the quiet study where Marie von Brühl had once sat, combing through Karl's writings, refining his arguments, ensuring that his voice would endure. Now, the ink on those pages had dried, the manuscript had been bound, and the world had moved on. The wars that Karl had studied had given way to new conflicts, new leaders, new ideas, but On War remained. It sat on the shelves of military academies across Europe, read by young officers preparing for battles they had yet to fight. It was debated in universities, referenced in diplomatic circles, quoted in war rooms. Kings and statesmen turned to it for guidance, sometimes misunderstanding it, sometimes twisting its lessons to fit their own ambitions. But the words endured, and with them, Marie's legacy, though few knew to look for it. In the final years of her life, Marie did not seek recognition. She had never been a woman who needed applause, who desired fame. She had done her work not for credit, but for conviction, for the belief that Karl's ideas mattered, that they needed to be preserved. She had spent her life fighting battles not with weapons, but with intellect, with strategy, with an unyielding determination that those in power had underestimated. She had won her war. When she died in 1836, there was no grand funeral, no monuments built in her honor. The world barely noticed her passing. But history, though slow, is not blind. Decades turned to centuries, and still On War shaped the world. By the time the 20th century dawned, Clausewitz's theories had become gospel for military thinkers across the globe. His ideas influenced the German High Command in World War I, guided strategists through the devastation of World War II, and found their way into Cold War doctrine as nations struggled to understand the new form of warfare that had emerged. Marie was not there to see it. She was not there when generals, from Eisenhower to Zhukov, absorbed Karl's teachings, applying them to battlefields far removed from the ones he had known. She was not there when statesmen quoted his famous dictum, "War is merely the continuation of policy by other means." But her presence was there, in every word. Had she not challenged Karl's ideas, refined them, helped him articulate them clearly, perhaps his work would have been lost to time. Had she not fought to ensure On War was published, perhaps the world would never have read it at all. Marie's fingerprints were invisible but undeniable. She had helped shape a book that had shaped history. The world eventually remembered Karl von Clausewitz. Statues were erected in his honor, his name carved into the halls of military academies, his ideas woven into the strategies of war. Scholars dissected his words, debated his theories, analyzed his legacy, and yet, his greatest ally, his fiercest critic, his intellectual equal, Marie remained in the shadows. But perhaps that was fitting. She had never needed recognition. She had never sought the spotlight. She had been the unseen strategist, the quiet force behind one of the most influential works in military history. The world would remember Karl. But Karl had never stood alone. Marie had been there, always, shaping history from behind the curtain. And though history may not have written her name in bold letters, her work had already been written in the minds of those who studied on war. She had fought. And she had won. Even if no one knew it.